This morning's lesson, I've entitled it Fragments, small pieces, usually of a much bigger whole. And just going through all the stuff that you go through every day and COVID and variants and all these other kinds of things, it's becoming very clear to me that none of us know everything about the pandemic. We get fragments, we get pieces, and sometimes we end up forming judgments based upon a very small fragment of what we read or what we hear. And I think that this translates into our life, not just as we live it, but certainly our own Christianity, our spirituality. And so I wanted to give you, hopefully, some words of encouragement from the Bible as it relates to looking at life sometimes in fragments. It's taken from Matthew chapter 6, verses 31 through 34. And this is Jesus speaking. Don't worry and ask yourselves, will we have anything to eat? Will we have anything to drink? Will we have any clothes to wear? Only people who don't know God are always worrying about such things. Your Father in heaven knows that you need all of these. But more than anything else, put God's work first and do what He wants. Then the other things will be yours as well. Don't worry about tomorrow. It will take care of itself. You have enough to worry about today. So let me ask you a question. Would you buy, let's say, a house if you were only allowed to see one of its rooms? Would you buy a car if you could only see a fender or a tire? Would you buy a book after reading only maybe one paragraph? I don't think I would. I don't think I'd buy a car sight unseen. I wouldn't buy a house by only seeing one bedroom. I certainly wouldn't purchase a book by reading one sentence or even one paragraph. But we sometimes do that with life, don't we? Because it's very true when it comes to evaluating life. For instance, one failure doesn't make a person a failure any more than one success makes that person a success. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 8, "The end of the matter is better than its beginning." Paul wrote in Romans chapter 12, verse 12, "Be patient in affliction." Another person wrote, "Don't judge a phrase by one word." And that was uttered by a woodcutter. And here's the backstory. Once upon a time, there was an old man who lived in a very tiny village. And although he was extremely poor, he was the envy of every villager in that little village because he owned this beautiful, beautiful white horse. Even the king had coveted this man's treasure because a horse like this had never, ever been seen before. This horse had this splendor about it, this majesty, this strength about it. People offered this man unbelievable sums of money to purchase this horse, but the old man always refused to sell. "This horse is not a horse to me," he would tell them. "It's a person. And how can you sell a person? He's a friend. He's not a possession. How could you ever sell a friend?" Granted, this man was extremely poor, and the temptation to sell that horse was enormous. But he never sold the horse. One morning, the horse was found missing from the man's stable. And all the villagers came out to see the old man. "You old fool," they mocked him. "We told you that someone would steal your horse. We warned you that you'd be robbed. You're dirt poor. How could you have ever hoped to protect such an incredibly valuable horse like that? It would have been so much better if you had sold him, because then you could have received whatever price you wanted, and no amount of money would have been ever too high. Now, your horse is gone, and you've been cursed with misfortune." The old man responded, "Don't speak too quickly. Say only that the horse is not in the stable. That's all we know. And the rest of the matter is your personal judgment. If I've been cursed or not, how can we know? How can you judge that?" But the people scolded the old man. "Don't make us out to be fools, you old man. We may not be philosophers, but great philosophy isn't what's needed at this point. The simple fact is that your horse is gone, and now you are cursed." The old man spoke up again. "All I know is that the stable is empty, and the horse is gone. The rest I do not know. Whether it's a cursing or a curse or a blessing, I really can't say. All we can see is a fragment. Who can say what will come next?" But the people of the village ridiculed him even more. They thought the old guy was crazy. They'd always thought he was a fool, because if he wasn't crazy or foolish, he would have sold the horse and lived off the money. Instead, he was a poor woodcutter, an old man still going out to the forests to cut the firewood and drag it back into the village to sell it to the villagers, which was comprised of the people who were heckling him about the horse. He lived hand to mouth. He lived in the grip of poverty. He was in miserable poverty. And now, at least in the eyes of the villagers, he had proven beyond all doubt that in fact he was a fool. After a few days, however, the horse returned. The horse hadn't been stolen after all. He'd simply run away into the forest. And not only had this horse returned, but he'd brought a dozen wild horses with him. Once again, the villagers went out to the woodcutter's place and spoke with the old man. "Old man, okay, you were right and we were wrong. We thought that you were cursed, but instead you've been blessed. Forgive us for coming to that judgment." The man responded, "Once again, you've gone too far. Say only that the horse is back. Say only that a dozen horses returned with him. But don't judge. How do you know if this is a blessing or not? You see only a fragment. Unless you know the whole story, how can you come to a judgment about the matter? You read only one page of a book. Can you judge the entire book? You read only one word of a phrase. Can you understand the entire phrase? Life is so vast, and yet you judge all of life with one page or one word. All you have is a fragment. Don't say that this is a blessing. No one knows. I'm content with what I do know, and I'm not bothered by what I don't. Maybe the old man's right, they said to each other. So they said very little, but deep down inside, they knew that he was wrong. They knew that it was a blessing. 12 wild horses had returned with his one horse. With a little bit of work, a little bit of training, the animals could be broken and then trained and sold, and the woodcutter would have a life's fortune ahead of him. Now, it just so happened that the old woodcutter had a son, an only son. And the young man began to break these dozen wild horses. Unfortunately, and after only a few days' work, the woodcutter's son fell off one of the horses and broke both of his legs. Once again, the villagers rushed out to see the woodcutter and surrounded the old man and cast judgment on him once again. "You were right," they said. "The dozen horses weren't a blessing because they are a curse. Your only son has broken his legs, and now you have no one to help you. You're poorer now than you were before." The old man spoke again. "You people are obsessed with judging. You can't go that far. Say only that my son broke his legs. Who knows if it's a blessing? Who knows if it's a curse? No one knows. We only have a fragment. Life comes in fragments." A few weeks later, the country had become engaged in a war against a neighboring country, and all of the young men of the village were required to join the army. Only the son of the old man was excluded because he was injured. Once again, the people spoke with the old man. This time, they were crying and screaming because their sons had been taken, and there was little chance that their sons would ever return because the enemy was strong and the war would be a losing battle. They'd never see their sons again. "You were right, old man," as they wept. "God knows that you were right. This proves it. Your son's accident was a blessing. His legs may be broken, but at least he's with you. Our sons are gone forever." The old man spoke again. "It's impossible to reason with you people. You always draw conclusions. No one knows. Say only this: your sons had to go to war and mine did not. No one knows if it's a blessing or a curse. No one is wise enough to know if it's a blessing or a curse. Only God knows." And the old man was right. Because we see and we hold a fragment. Life's mishaps and calamities are only a page out of a life-sized book. We should be slow about drawing conclusions. We should reserve judgment on life's storms until we know the whole story, don't you think? I don't know where the woodcutter learned his patience, since that was just a Portuguese fable. Or was it? Maybe the woodcutter learned it from another woodcutter, this woodcutter in Galilee. Because it was the carpenter from Galilee who said it best: "Don't worry about tomorrow. It will take care of itself." But that doesn't stop us, does it? We worry. And because we worry, a lot of us start making lists. Lists for us seemingly are very reassuring. They comfort us. They suggest that the chaos of the universe can be mastered and tamed, maybe even understood within the confines of a tidy little column. To list is to understand. It's to solve. Maybe it's even to control. And for that reason, we simply can't resist the urge to create these lists, particularly at the end of the year, and we spew out lists like Washington, D.C. spews out legislation. We list the best movies. We list the best books. We list the worst dressed. We list the most used. We list the least popular. We list the most mysterious and the highest paid. We salute the good and we satire the bad. We even sum up the year on lists. And although New Year's Day probably ranks as the top of the list-producing days, including those notorious New Year's resolutions, I don't know how you're doing on your own, but they seemingly fade in January. The rest of the year is by no means listless. For instance, your grocery list. It makes a trip to the market manageable. Your calendar probably has a to-do space where you organize and number the things that you'd like to do and probably won't. Your syllabus tells you which books to buy. Your itinerary tells you which plane to take. And your cell phone tells you which numbers to dial. But take heart. If it's any consolation, the Bible has its share of lists too. Moses brought one down from the mountain, the list of 10 commandments. Noah, for all we know, might have used a list as he loaded up the ark. Jesus gave a list of principles in the Sermon on the Mountain. Matthew and Luke listed genealogies of Jesus. John listed the splendors of heaven. These are lists, there are lists of the gifts of the Spirit. There are lists of good fruit and bad fruit. There are lists of salutations, and there are lists of greetings, all in the Bible. So if you're going to make a list, I would suggest that you make your list like a lighthouse. Lighthouses are immutable. They are immovable. They are indestructible. And candidates for this list, if you're going to make one, should only qualify if they have characteristics like a lighthouse. Because a lighthouse warns you of what? Potential danger. They signal safe harbor. They're stronger than the storm. And they shine brightest in the fog. These kinds of lists contain more than just good ideas if you're going to be making them. Personal preferences or even honest opinions. They're God-given, time-tested truths that define the way that we should be navigating our lives. If we observe them, we can enjoy safe passage. If we ignore them, we will crash into the jagged rocks of reality. So, in honor of Steve, here's an excerpt from the United States Naval Institute Proceedings. It is a magazine from the Naval Institute, and Frank Cook illustrated the importance of obeying these lighthouse rules. Here's what he wrote. 2 battleships assigned to the training squadron had been at sea on maneuvers in heavy weather for several days. I was serving on the lead battleship and was on watch on the bridge as night began to fall. The visibility was poor with patchy fog, so the captain remained on the bridge, keeping an eye on all of the activities going on.
Shortly after dark, the lookout on the wing reported, "Light, bearing on the starboard bow." "Is it steady or is it moving astern?" the captain called out. The lookout replied, "Steady, Captain," which meant we were on a dangerous collision course with that ship. The captain then called to the signalman, "Signal that ship. We are on a collision course. Advise you change course 20 degrees. Back came the signal. "Advisable for you to change course 20 degrees. The captain said, "Send this. I'm a captain. Change course 20 degrees. "I'm a seaman, second class," came the reply. "You had better change course 20 degrees. By that time, the captain was furious. He spat out, "Send this. I'm a battleship. Change your course 20 degrees. Back came the flashing light. "I'm a lighthouse." We changed course. That was a smart move, don't you think? Because the wise captain shifts the direction of his craft according to the signal of the lighthouse. And a wise person will do the same. So here's a few of the lights that I'm encouraging you to look out for, and perhaps the signals that we should heed. Love God more than you fear hell. When no one is watching, live as if someone is. Succeed at home first. Don't spend tomorrow's money today. Pray twice as much as you worry. Listen twice as much as you speak. Only harbor a grudge when God does. It's wiser to err on the side of generosity than on the side of scrutiny. God has forgiven you. You would be wise to do the same. And when you can't trace God's hand, then trust his heart. And here's a few more to conclude. Toot your own horn, and the notes will fall flat. Don't feel guilty because of God's goodness. The book of life is lived in chapters, so know your page. Never let the important be the victim of the trivial. And last but not least, live your liturgy. In other words, approach life like the woodcutter, or approach life like a voyage on a ship. Be wise and don't draw hasty conclusions based upon a fragment. Enjoy the view. Explore the vessel. Make friends with the captain. Even fish a little. And then be sure to use the gangway when you get home. Church, we are bombarded by fragments of opinions and data and discussions and writings. Fragments, little bits and little pieces. And we have the tendency to then form and draw conclusions from these little fragments that we see. Our lives would be so much more joyful if we would just know what we know and leave the rest to God. Because then we could walk through life with absolute confidence, knowing what we know and letting God deal with the rest. And I think that's why David, and in my opinion frustratingly so, referred to God's word as a lamp unto my feet. I was blessed when we had Fred with us. As you know, Fred was quite the collector. And so every once in a while, I would share a story or a little vignette, and without fail, Fred would have something in that museum of his that fit with something that I said in a message. For instance, one time I talked about the widow's 2 mites. Well, sure enough, Fred had this little package with these 2 little mites that he gave to me. I talked about the virgins who were waiting for the bride and the groom to come and their oil lamps, and he gave me one of these little oil lamps. Well, one of the other things that Fred gave me, they're all treasures, but this one particularly so, and it's nothing fancy. It's got a long stem to it, and it's got a base, and it's probably the base is about this big, and on it you put a candle, and around it is glass. And so back when they didn't have a lot of light, they would use this, light the candle, which was protected by the glass surrounding it, put it down by their feet to shed light on the pathway to which you were walking. In other words, that light gave you just enough light to see where you were to take the next step. Most of us would like to have a light that shows us 2 years down the road where we want to go or where we would like to go. And I don't know, but if we knew that much information about our lives, it might be so frightening we might not take that next step. I don't know. But David writes that God's word is a lamp unto our feet. And Fred shared that with me, and I treasure it and share it with you now. Because sometimes the fragments that we see are just enough light for us to take that next step. It's not necessarily a path to show us miles down the road. And if we start drawing conclusions based upon little fragments, we may end up drawing the wrong conclusion and really causing ourselves more grief than it satisfies. So with all the data and all the opinions and all the divisiveness and all the stuff that's going on in the world today, my encouragement to you is just know what you know and let God deal with the rest. Have enough faith to take that next step and let God deal with the conclusions to be drawn from the fragments of life. His perspective is very different than our own. And one day we'll be with him to share in that perspective. But for now, be like the woodcutter. Know what you know and leave the rest